Good afternoon, everyone in the Americas, and good evening to those of you in Europe, and a very late good evening to those in Israel, and a good morning in Australasia. We have an amazing response from around the world for a series called Jew Hatred Exposed, which the Wiesenthal Center, along with its Museum of Tolerance and in partnership with Club C, have putting together for you in the course of the next few weeks. Today, our first session is how anti-Semitism became anti-Zionism. We have three amazing individuals who bring scholarship and frontline experience from the wars, from the battle against history's oldest virus, anti-Semitism, who have a lot to share with you. The format, we'll be hearing first from Mr. Mark Weitzman, followed by Dr. Naya Lekht, and then Dr. Judea Pearl, each of whom will have an opening statement. We'll then have a number of questions from the moderator, myself, and we'll have the lines open to you to send your questions in for this session. For those of you who have friends and colleagues who will want to also view these proceedings, we hope to have that up online in a matter of a few days. So let's get right to it. Our first presenter today, my friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Weitzman, who is Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He's based in New York. That means he's also a representative at the United Nations in New York. He's also been an official member of the United States delegation from the State Department to the International Holocaust Remembrance Agency that has produced an amazing and important and definitive definition of anti-Semitism. Followed by Mark will be Dr. Naya Lekht, who is the head of Club Z, and Dr. Judea Pearl will be our third presenter, and I will give a more formal introduction to those two speakers in a few moments. For starters, I turn over the portal, if you will, to Mark Weitzman.
Thank you, Rabbi Cooper. It is really an honor to be part of this panel with such distinguished speakers and colleagues and friends. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak to everybody out in the audience as well. I only have a few minutes to make my remarks, and I want to sort of concentrate on why Rabbi Cooper mentioned my efforts in terms of helping initiate a working definition of anti-Semitism. And I really want to kind of explain the necessity and the importance of this effort. To begin with, FBI statistics for the last year available, 2019, showed that in the area of hate crimes based on religion, 60%, over 60% of the crimes reported were motivated by anti-Jewish bias. The next highest number, 13.2%, were victims of anti-Muslim bias. So overwhelmingly in the United States, per religion, Jews were the most heavily targeted number of victims in hate crimes. And even other surveys show that 9 out of 10 Jews in the US feel that anti-Semitism is a significant problem and has increased greatly in the last 5 years. We've seen it, if that's those statistics, but we've seen it ourselves, just the eye test, as they say, starting perhaps in Charlottesville with the Nazi salute, the chants, the Nazi slogans, the chant "Jews will not replace us," the incredible wave of violence over the past 2-3 years, synagogue shootings in Pittsburgh at Poway, the shooting in Jersey City just over a year ago, where Jews were targeted and literally murdered on the streets or in the halls of synagogues itself. And even just last week, the events in the Capitol, the riot and the rioters marching through the Capitol, some wearing Holocaust denial T-shirts, the anti-Semitism that was part of the rallying message online on social media to get these people together, show that anti-Semitism is really strong, vital, viscerant, and no longer an undercurrent, but really it is a force and a factor in American society. And that one of the shocks and one of the reasons that was such a shock, and I was talking to somebody in a congressional staffer last week who said that the sight of people walking through Congress with signs or sweatshirts with slogans that denied the Holocaust and distorted the Holocaust was something because essentially after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism had become repudiated by the political mainstream in the US and Europe. And a high UN official in a report on anti-Semitism to the General Assembly last year said that anti-Semitism was toxic to democracy. So we had this consensus that anti-Semitism was bad, and that consensus was shattered over the past few years. So it's agreed that we need to fight it, not just to protect us as Jews, but to protect our democracies as well. So the question is, how do we fight it? And the first question, how to fight it, is how to define it. Because it's not so simple. You have someone like Louis Farrakhan who made a speech in which he called Jews satanic Jews, and in the same speech denied being anti-Semitic. You have in the University of Illinois, for example, mandatory diversity training that glorified terrorists who were literally in groups and organizations defined as terrorists by the US government and yet held up as positive figures, or the equation of Jews and Zionists with Nazis. In Europe, where the wave of anti-Semitic violence has been even greater over the past decade, you had cases where, for example, a synagogue was firebombed in the city of Wuppertal in Germany in 2014, and despite the protest of the events in Gaza, and despite the arrests and the clear evidence against and the confessions of the perpetrators of that crime, 2 German courts threw out their conviction on the grounds of hate crimes, on the grounds that it was protected political speech. So you have a fuzziness, or people not being sure what anti-Semitism really is. As Rabbi Cooper mentioned, I've been involved for 20 years since it began with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is 34 nations now, composed of academics, experts in museums, research, education, memorials, and so on, along with diplomats. It's the only intergovernmental organization that deals specifically with Holocaust and with anti-Semitism. And we decided, sitting around the table a number of years ago, we realized that we were not necessarily meaning the same thing when we talked about anti-Semitism. So I introduced this definition, the text of this definition. It took 5 years to get it through because every country has to agree. That operates by consensus, IHRA, and that means every country has to agree before anything can be formally adopted and officially adopted. And as you can imagine, with 34 countries coming from, mostly in Europe, countries where anti-Semitism has been extraordinarily high in the past and is still evident in the present, it was not a simple matter, but we got through with it. And it is non-legally binding. It is basically a description. You can find it on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance website. It's a description of anti-Semitism, summation, followed by 11 concrete examples to give flesh to it. And the examples are both traditional anti-Semitism that include ideas of Jews as bloodsuckers or Christ killers, or what the traditional themes were, along with a number that relate specifically to Israel and how Israel today has become the focus of a lot of anti-Semitic attacks and targeting of Jews. And it talks about how not just Jews are being targeted as Jews, but as representatives of Israel, even if they were not necessarily so. And it's been adopted since then by 34 countries, by 28 countries have subsequently adopted it. And it created an international consensus around the meaning of anti-Semitism, given how much social media has broken down national boundaries and borders, and how the language of anti-Semitism is transmitted virally around the world. This more than ever is the importance of having an internationally accepted consensus on what anti-Semitism is more important now than ever. It has been adopted by the United States State Department. It has been adopted by the Department of Education and helping as a tool to help identify what might be anti-Semitic hate crimes on campus. That was the basis of President Trump's executive order, December 2019, in which he adopted the definition for that purpose. And it has been adopted, for example, by over 640 members of parliament in the United Kingdom, by hundreds of universities and cities around the world, by soccer and football teams. And the idea is simply that it sets a standard, a bar, in which we can know what anti-Semitism is, and then we can begin to take concrete steps about it. And in that sense,
I'm going to be coming back to you for follow up on IHRA and related issues in a few minutes. Right now, I'd like to go to Dr. Naya Lekht, who was born in the former Soviet Union, came with her family to the US in 1989. She holds a PhD from UCLA in Russian Jewish literature. She's a frontline fighter, right on the front lines of these issues that Mark outlined. She's currently Director of Education for Club Z, a national Zionist institute and advocacy movement. In her role, Dr. Lekht has developed an innovative approach to teaching the Arab-Israeli conflict, as well as equipping teens with tools to identify and combat anti-Semitism. Dr. Lekht has written and lectured extensively on the history of anti-Semitism and has served as scholar in residence in many locations, including at Oxford University through the ISGAP. My pleasure and honor to ask Dr. Lekht to give us a frontline report about what's going on campuses, and how young do we have to start if we're parents to be concerned about what our kids will be hearing. Dr. Lekht.
Thank you so much for having me, Rabbi Cooper. And I too am extremely honored to be sharing this virtual stage with Mark Weitzman and Dr. Pearl. I think it's really great that I'm actually following Mark's comments, because they really give you a very good top-down approach of the problem. And what I would like to offer is more of a bottom-up approach, meaning what is actually happening on the ground as I see it with my students and the many students that I encounter. So look, it used to be that we thought that the epicenter of anti-Semitism, especially anti-Zionism, which is, I argue, today's most powerful form of anti-Semitism, is to be found on college campuses. And that is no longer true. Unfortunately, the hate, the Jew hatred is now in high schools. And at Club Z, we actually did our own survey among about 150 teens, American Jewish teens, to get the pulse on what they're experiencing. And we found the results were that 1 out of 3 teens does not feel comfortable saying that they are a Zionist in school. Likewise, they will not post on social media that they are a Zionist. Another important statistic or data point is that 67% of our students encounter anti-Israel bias in the classroom, usually in social studies classes and sometimes even literature classes. And coming from this, from my position of somebody who has been studying anti-Semitism, I ask why. Why is this happening? Why did this occur? And I think not only is it an issue of definition, but it's an issue of educational approach. And I think, unfortunately, we've done a grave malpractice, if you will, in education by universalizing anti-Semitism, by not treating it as its own phenomenon, as its own virus, if you will, with its own unique DNA structure. And something that we do teach our teens, and something that I've developed at Club Z in our curriculum, is how do you identify anti-Semitism? Because if you're gonna just look at it as racism, right, you're just going to be able to identify one of the 6 major accusations, and that's dehumanization. But Jews, unlike any other minority, are accused of superhuman powers, such as global world domination, controlling the banks and the media, blood libel. These are not race inherent to racism. So the problem is that a lot of our students, when they encounter anti-Semitism, i.e. anti-Zionism, what happens is they'll come in with a program, and the program is called anti-racist training or racist training, and they don't deal with what is actually today's anti-Semitism, which is anti-Zionism. Jews are not victims of racism today. Jews are victims of anti-Semitism, and we need to call it out. And so what we do is we decouple anti-Semitism from racism. That doesn't mean that it sometimes doesn't overlap, but especially when it comes to Israel, when you have an Israeli flag drenched in blood, that is not racism, that is blood libel, which is unique to Jews. So our students are able to pick up those signals and are able to identify it early on right away. And that's very important, because I'll have to tell you this also. When I was teaching also in college at UCLA, I taught a class on the history of Russian Jews. And I started in my lectures referencing blood libel, protocols of the elders of Zion, and students had never heard of it. And I think that was, if I had to pinpoint when I decided that I wanted to devote my professional career to helping students, young adults, identify anti-Semitism, I realized they don't know. So I think, as Mark said, a proper definition, but so important is proper education. And unfortunately, we're not getting that. So that's what I wanted to impart today. So.
Thank you for that introduction. And for our third speaker, I'm actually going to give Dr. Judea Pearl 2 introductions. The first one you can find online pretty much anywhere. I have to warn you in advance, I don't understand anything about his scientific work, but I believe that someone who's received the Turing Award, which is known as the Nobel Prize in the computer field, we should know who it is that we're going to hear from in a few minutes. So Judea Pearl is an Israeli-American computer scientist and philosopher, best known for championing the probabilistic approach to artificial intelligence and the development of Bayesian networks. He's also credited for developing a theory of causal and counterfactual inference based on structural models. In 2011, the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM, awarded Pearl with the Turing Award, the highest distinction in computer science, quote, for fundamental contributions to artificial intelligence through the development of a calculus for probabilistic and causal reasoning, unquote. Which means, had it not been for a horrific experience in the life of Dr. Pearl and his wonderful wife, Ruth, when their son, Daniel Pearl, the great renowned journalist from the Wall Street Journal, was kidnapped and murdered, we probably would have met occasionally, perhaps at a Hillel event on the campus of UCLA. But Dr. Judea Pearl has emerged over these years as an amazing teacher and role model, first and foremost for Jews, but beyond that, for everyone on campus, and someone who was pursued through the Daniel Pearl Foundation of identifying and empowering moderates in the Arab and Muslim world. He's been doing this for years, and with, I think, a degree of success. When he was asked at one time why he stayed involved after everyone else went home, after the Kaddish and after the Shloshim and after the Yartzeit, why did Dr. Pearl stay involved? He said the following: hate killed my son, therefore I am determined to fight hate. A great scientist, a great American, a great Israeli, and a tremendous mensch, person who I look up to, and whose counsel I seek, and would be a much better professional at my job if I listened to more often. But it's a distinct privilege to ask Dr. Judea Pearl to dive right in and share his perspective with the international audience. Dr. Pearl.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Cooper, for this unfitting introduction. I feel like I don't have to speak anymore after that kind of introduction, but you gave me a good hook on my subject. It's not casual reasoning, it's causal reasoning. That's what the reason why
I rest my case.
Good. Now, that's why I feel a little uncomfortable fitting into the scheme here, which deals with the relationship between the causal relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The first part of my talk will be an attempt to decouple the two, to describe anti-Zionism independently of the causal relationship with anti-Semitism, and treat anti-Zionism as a moral deformity which earns its own dangerous character and a racist character on its own without any relationship to anti-Semitism. The second part of my talk, I'll try to outline my vision of how to fight anti-Zionism from a moral fortitude point of view and cast in liberal vocabulary. And the third part, I'll try to borrow ideas from fighting anti-Zionism into the campus environment with which I'm more familiar. That is UCLA and some of the campuses around it with which I had some contact. So let me start with decoupling the causal connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It's obvious that the two are causally related. If anti-Semitism regards Jews as a second-class human being, defective class of human being, so obviously Jews do not deserve a state. So the relationship going from anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism is obvious. And it goes the other way also. If if Israel is indeed guilty of being the source of all evil in the world, and if it is the main obstacle to peace in the world, then by statistical counting alone, Jews are suspect of supporting Israel. And by statistical reasoning alone, Jews should be marginalized on campus, suspect on campus, not given the same treatment as as non-Jews. So the relationship is obvious. What is not so obvious is the degree to which it evolved. Just yesterday in Johns Hopkins University, a teaching assistant asked innocently an ethical dilemma. Okay, when I grade Zionist students' exams, should I give them full points, or should I take some points down on account of them being supportive of ethnic cleansing? And the crowd, and with social media, roared back and say, fail them, fail them. This is a degree to which anti-Zionism today has penetrated the mindset of university environment. So what is my method of fighting anti-Zionism? First, in parallel with the legal part that Marcus talked about, the legal essence of anti-Semitism, okay, we need to fight, to move the fight from the legal domain into the moral arena. And here we should fight from a moral fortitude rather than moral victimhood. The Jewish community today is split into two parts. Those who see Israel as a God-promised land, and those who see Israel as an embarrassment, or if not a disaster. The first is normally we can find in Orthodox or some conservative synagogues. Second one is a characteristic of a liberal part or progressive part of the Jewish community. And I want to introduce a third component to the Jewish community, the liberal pride. My grandson go to Berkeley Synagogue, and the rabbi there refused to chant the blessing for Israel. Barech et Medinat Israel. Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, the beginning of our redemption. Why? Because Israel for him is an embarrassment. And we should turn the table around and say Zionism is the most noble enterprise that took place in the 20th century. Why? Because Israel is an embodiment of a unique and inspirational and universal idea that we can share and we can contribute to the liberal community in their term, in their own vocabulary. It's the idea of auto-emancipation. It's the name of the booklet published in 1881, I believe, by Leon Spinsker, but it resonates today as much as it did in 1881. Where else can you find a scattered tribe of middlemen, of paupers, lifting itself from the margin of history to become a world center of art and science and business enterprise? Whereas such a miracle does not happen every day, and this is what we can teach the rest of humanity, including the rest of the liberal community. From that idea of self-worth, we should be able to defend it. And the first, the first litmus test, whether you have a self-worth or not, is whether you are willing to defend it. And you're only being respected to the degree to which you are willing to defend your honor and your worthiness. So, in that context, I recommend very high that we use fighting words to indicate our willingness to defend our worth. And the fighting word that I found most fitting is Zion-phobia. We have to be able to attack our accusers and our detractors for the evil that they represent, for the moral deformity that they represent. So the use of the word xenophobia means there is something wrong with you if you deny my people the right to a homeland. There is something basic, liberally speaking, something basically wrong with your mental architecture. And that fighting word, I'm trying for the past few years to get it to the vocabulary of every Jewish writer, every pro-Zionist. Still, I cannot declare success. And why is it so important? Because we have, once you have this attitude and moral fortitude, then you find every accusation that they roll onto you to be an invitation to expose the weakness of the accuser. I find extremely opportunistically. I am enticed, and I feel very comfortable when I'm accused of things like colonialism, Nakba, and apartheid, and indigenous people and white settlers. For me, it's an invitation to show the weakness of the accuser. And my favorite, of course, is colonialism. Where else can you find, a colonialist, a white settlers colonialist, that celebrates holidays after the event that took place in the land to which they come, and not the land from which they came. Okay? So all this accusation for me becomes an invitation to expose the weaknesses of the accuser.
Thank you, Dr. Pearl. We'll come back to you in a few minutes. Let me circle back to our two other panelists. Dr. Pearl, his presentation about utilizing the term xenophobia, without question, also addresses the same question that's coming across from some of the people watching. Why do we insist on having a relationship between those who oppose Israel and Zionism and the term anti-Semitism? How is it possible that you can call someone, for example, Jewish, who might be an anti-Semite? How could that be? I would just put out there also for everyone to be reminded that in 2021, the largest single Jewish community in the world now resides in the state of Israel. It's well over 6 million Jews. So taking Dr. Pearl's challenge to us, I'm going to circle back to both of our speakers. And Dr. Lekht, let me ask you, Naya, for starters, is this term that Dr. Pearl, in the context that he raises it, will that help you in the frontline battle for the hearts and minds first of Jewish kids and in trying to decouple those who hate us from their hate?
So with all due respect to Dr. Pearl, and if I may push back just a bit, I view it a little bit differently. I am looking at the language of anti-Semitism and how it evolves. And the term anti-Semitism was coined by Wilhelm Marr. And it was coined by Wilhelm Marr in order to differentiate himself from Judeophobia. Now, Jew hatred is, as you know, the oldest hatred. So when he created this new word for something that is very ancient, why was he doing this? Why did he create a new word? And in my readings and in my research, I firmly believe that he was a very successful branding guru, if you will. What he did is he peddled a Jew hatred that the population at that time that became that was acceptable. So what he did, in effect, is he said, "Look, I'm not a Judeophobe. I'm an anti-Semite," and in that way, he made it acceptable. Now, when I came to college campus in 2001, the first thing I heard was, "I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm an anti-Zionist." I'm not. And they differentiated themselves from this unacceptable form of Jew hatred, which was 20th century anti-Semitism culminating with the Holocaust. And so these anti-Semites create a neologism. And why do they do this? Because they're actually packaging this same Jew hatred. It's really the same, it's really tapping into the same accusations, Jews as killing babies. Israel is now accused of the same things, bent on world domination, accusing Israel of, quote, hypnotizing the world, demonization. These are unique accusations. It doesn't matter if we call it Judeophobia, anti-Semitism, or anti-Zionism. We're dealing with the same hatred. What we have to understand is that when these people who are anti-Semites, they're creating this new language in order to peddle and push anti-Jew hatred. And that is very important, because if we're going to start having a conversation about, well, we need to really understand what anti-Zionism is. No, it's not anti-Semitism, and it's not Judeophobia, and all these different terms, we're losing sight of the fact that we are dealing with the same hatred. It's just mutated, if you will. So for me, I do teach our students that this is Jew hatred masked as anti-Zionism. The story of Wilhelm Marr is very instructive for me as a student of history. What he did when he coined that word was extremely successful, because anti-Semitism became fashionable. It was progressive to be an anti-Semite, as it is progressive today to be an anti-Zionist.
Thank you, Naya. Mark, let me come to you next. You mentioned before, no less than 5 years sitting with diplomats of all stripes from scores of countries, working on a working definition. First of all, how's it going in terms of its application? You said it isn't legally binding, but it is being used and it widely. And I'm also going to pivot with you to a second point, which I'll then come back to our other two panelists, which is that, recently the Wiesenthal Center put out its top 10 incidents of 2020. And many of those were directly linked to anti-Zionism, to BDS, and to pushing back, especially in Germany and on American campuses, in pushing back against the very definition of anti-Semitism that you and your diplomatic colleagues worked and toiled so hard to reach. Would you comment, please, on those? Please come off your mute.
Okay, so I'll try to keep this very brief. So first of all, if I can just begin where I think Naya left off with the Wilhelm Marr, I think it's important to note, and Naya kind of touched upon it at the end, that what Marr was doing was using the language of the popular intellectual current of the time, which was social Darwinism, et cetera, and creating this sort of false taxonomy of races and including anti-Semitism there, differentiated from the popular street element Jew hatred that was out there. He wanted to give it a higher intellectual sheen and gloss. So in that sense, that's what he tried to do. And we see the same intellectual currents today where people try to use whatever is popular in academic circles or in certain circles to kind of as their cover for the anti-Semitism that will still come up. So the methodology and the packaging is somewhat similar in that regard. But I think we also have to acknowledge that anti-Semitism today still has a lot of the traditional tropes in it, not just the new forms focused on Israel. Just having pointed that out. So to get to what you asked directly, I think one of the things that we found was that our definition was targeting acts that committed against the state of Israel or against the entity of Israel as a nation. We didn't get into discussions about thought patterns that much. We wanted to really, because it's a very practical definition for political tool, for educational tool, and it's legally non-binding, as you mentioned. We wanted to keep it on a very narrowly, tightly focused lens there. And so we said that criticism targeting the state of Israel as a Jewish collectivity is a form of anti-Semitism, but certainly legitimately criticizing the state of Israel in many ways can be, as any other country is open to criticism, can be fine. Any criticism of the state of Israel is not automatically anti-Semitic. And I think that it needs to be pointed out that the differentiation is the double standard that Natan Sharansky talked about, the demonization, the denial of the right of Jews, and this is where Dr. Pearl is right on target, for self-determination, to have their own country. Going across those red lines takes you into anti-Semitism. A criticism of a certain policy, a given politician is something, well, roughly at least half of the Israeli population does that on a daily basis and makes a living doing that. So I think that we have to be careful about the use of it, but it has become necessary. The definition, and I think one of its success is because it's not an academic definition, because it's not a theoretical definition. It's not something to, you could do a seminar in historiography of defining anti-Semitism. Believe me, I sat through those in grad school. This is not that. This is a very specific, practical element to be used in very practical ways for people who are trying to work on it on the ground in real time and to develop solutions in regard to it. And the examples that I gave, there's a new publication that I contributed to from the EU and IHRA, which is a handbook on implementing the definition. And it gives illustrations of the examples. And the idea there is that by illustrating and showing it, it shows how it can be used in real time, in real ways, to help people who are trying to figure out ways to combat anti-Semitism on campus and in the political and real world.
Thank you, Mark. If you go to Wiesenthal.com, our website, you can get a link to be able to download that new report from the European Union. Dr. Pearl, let me come back to you with a question which is popping from a number of people who are watching, although some are posing it more politely, not all. They're basically saying is that what all three panelists are trying to do is to cover for Israel's crimes and to silence legitimate concerns of Palestinians and others who are criticizing the Jewish state by staining them with the accusation of Judea-phobia, anti-Semitism, Jew hatred. What would you respond? I'm sure you've heard it directly on campus. What would you just respond to the people who are watching, who've either heard it or believe it?
I didn't quite get what exactly is the accusation?
The accusation is that this entire exercise, whether you call it Judea-phobia, or you call it anti-Semitism or Jew hatred, is just meant to silence the legitimate concerns of Palestinians and those who criticize Israel with the stain that they are, by definition, anti-Semitic.
Well, it's obviously you can criticize the state of Israel or the policy of state Israel without denying the Jewish right to self-determination. So we are dealing here with the distinction between criticizing policies and criticizing the right of a collective to sovereignty. And that's two different things altogether. And the way I present a litmus test, I said the following. I use the slogan, two states for two people, equally legitimate and equally indigenous. Now, why do I say equally indigenous? Because this is something that no Palestinian can agree with, and I can agree with. And this is something which is acceptable to be sharing, symmetrical. And liberals love symmetry. Okay? So here's an example of exposing the asymmetry of the Palestinian argument. Equally indigenous. We are willing to share the land, and they are not willing to share the land. It must start with that. But I want to continue and answer Dr. Naya, Dr. Yeah, why and why positioning our fight today in the context of anti-Semitism can be a distraction, if not a betrayal of the cause. And I'll give you an example. The example came from USC. You're all familiar with the case of Rose Rich, who was forced to resign her position as a vice chairman, maybe, or vice chair of the student body, accused of being a Zionist. And the 43 prominent professors in USC came out with a statement: we are Zionists. The contention was about the ability or the right of Zionist students, not Jewish, Zionist students, to take on a position in student government. What did the university do? Never mention the word Zionist. Try to move it, to shove it into the anti-Semitic arena, where they feel comfortable and where they can justify their inaction. So anti-Semitism became an invitation and an invitation for inaction, and actually an agreement between the university administration and the Jewish leadership on campus. I cover you cover me for inaction, and I'll give you the appearance of action. They feel very comfortable discussing anti-Semitism because they give it to people whose business, whose entire career is invested in studying anti-Semitism with the old tools and the old vocabulary. And they are not able to discuss one thing. They haven't yet spelled the word Zionism in all their official statements. Why do you think they do that? To cover up for inaction.
So actually, I'm in agreement, if I may, with you. The problem is that they're not teaching anti-Semitism correctly. They are stuck in the 19th and 20th century in how they treat anti-Semitism. That's the issue. I agree with you completely. But if we kind of zoom out for a second and look at the Jew in every kind of century, if we look at the Jew in medieval times, they are violators of Christian tenets, right? Because that is what the world at that time viewed as morality, was Christianity, right? In the 19th century, the Jew was the violator of the race in the social Darwinism. And today the Jew, i.e. Israel, Zionist Jew, is the violator of human rights. It's the same mechanics at play. So how would you, let me ask you a question, Dr. Pearl. How would you then say to someone, look, I have nothing against Jews, it's just Zionists? Because somebody did write that in the question. I love Jews, my problem is with Zionists. No problem with Jews.
Morally deranged.
No,
because Zionism is a beautiful idea, and right, and it is a right by all liberal standards. And I can go up to John Stuart Mill or Fukuyama in the definition of what self-determination is and what historical and what identity and what indigeneity means. Okay, so by liberal standards, Zionism is a powerful and a virtuous idea. If you are anti-Zionist, then you are, by your own standard, right, deranged, morally impaired.
Well, let me just, we're coming towards the end of this first of three-part series. And those of you who know anything about me, I'm really quiet for very long, but I, like the amazing audience here that has stood by, hundreds of people, for over 45 minutes, to learn from each of our amazing presenters. I'd like to weigh in following up a little bit what Dr. Pearl just said. The price to be paid for those who, when they hear the word Zionism, see racism, see illegitimacy, see apartheid, see every evil in the world. The price for that kind of, you used the term, derangement, is quite far-ranging. If you go to Wiesenthal.com and you download our top 10, which you'll see on our website, you'll also be able to link through to the letter that the USC professors wrote, 43 of them who signed it as proud Zionists. You'll be able to see a great deal of other examples. I think the most amazing and disturbing of which is what happened and didn't happen in the last year in Germany. For the last 12 months, the leading, and probably 24 at least, cultural institutions in Germany met secretly once a month for a year with the assistance of the third-ranking member of the Foreign Ministry of Germany to plot how they could push back against the Bundestag vote that defined BDS as anti-Semitism. And a few weeks ago, last month, they launched their counterattack, followed by 900 elite cultural personalities who basically are upset that they cannot hide their hatred for the state of Israel behind anti-Zionism. They've been exposed and they want to see that reversed. So what's the price to pay? We understand in Israel, Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Arabs, individually, we get that. But imagine that while all of this is taking place at USC, at University of Illinois, elsewhere, the state of Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and now Sudan, along with 2 or 3 other Arab Muslim states that are looking, have now signed what are really the Abrahamic Accords that brings about a renewal of relationship, of warm relationships between cousins who've been distraught and distracted and worse for a very, very long time. Germany happens to be centrally placed to help that kind of warm peace grow, especially in the cultural domain. So what if we had, in the last 12 months in Germany, instead of the brain trust that they have in impacting on European and global culture and helping to reach out further to Israelis and Arabs and Muslims in their own country and beyond, and sort of deepen the roots of peace and coexistence and mutual respect, they were busy following the anti-Zionist screed and how they could resurrect it from the garbage heap, the political garbage heap in Germany. I want to thank our 3 presenters today, Dr. Judea Pearl, Dr. Naya Lekht, Mark Weitzman from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, for a very powerful and lively discussion. You can tell for sure it's a Jewish discussion because unlike in the days of Joseph Stalin, or if you visit North Korea or communist China today, when you know what the votes are going to be before there's even a discussion. The Jewish way is always to discuss and again and again and to question. And I hope, like myself, each of you out there also has learned a great deal from this three-way discussion from three crucial leaders in the fight for Jewish dignity and for the respect of the vision that the Jews have prayed for centuries, a return to Zion, and to understand that in the not only in the faith communities, in the religious domain, but also in the cultural, political, and social domain. We invite each of you to join us for the next presentation that will take place in February. I think it'll be shown on our screen momentarily. There it is on February 21st, 2021, and invite you to go to Club Z's website, as well as the Museum of Tolerance and the Simon Wiesenthal Center. We appreciate all of the questions that came in. We apologize that we haven't been able to get to every one of them, but I believe we've had an amazingly insightful and important discussion that moves forward our hope of defending the rights of Jewish students on campus and the rights of the Jewish people to pursue its destiny. Thank you to Dr. Pearl, Dr. Lekht, and to Mark Weitzman, and good day from a lockdown Los Angeles, California.
Thank you so much. Thank you.